The Andy Pollin Show.
We got to go after this with everything we got, figuring they're going to come with everything they got.
I'll start off by saying I'm bored, I'm broke, and I'm back.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630 starts right now.
It is days like this that are both the worst and the best days for talk radio. Worst in that I've lost a friend. More importantly, we've all lost somebody who we consider a friend, and in some cases, people considered him to be an enemy, but you could not ignore him, nor could you ignore his incredible talent, work ethic, and the force of nature that he was for 69 years. John Feinstein passed away yesterday at the age of 69, and that is a horrible thing to comprehend. But this is a forum where we have the time and the space to talk about his life and talk about my personal remembrances and the remembrances of those who knew him best. And probably nobody knew him better than Tony Kornheiser. I was a little bit disappointed that he had the day off yesterday on PTI. I don't know if he's going to do a radio show today. We carry that 3 days a week from 2 to 3. So I'm not sure whether he's doing a show today. But if he is, I would imagine he'll spend the whole show talking about John Feinstein, who was, well, he was his friend. He was also his confidant. He was, at times, his mortal enemy. But they always seem to come back together. And I guess in many ways, they will always be linked. They each went on to unimaginably successful careers. And if you look at how they both started, both thinking that they were going to spend their lives as sports writers where they would make a decent wage, but certainly not become fabulously rich, as they both were able to do, and deservedly so, and make their mark as two of the greatest sports journalists who ever lived, and did it in various forums, including the newspaper business. In the case of John, many books. Tony wrote several books, and television. And television, as Tony likes to say, Tony will always say that television makes you rich and famous, radio is the most fun, and writing is the hardest thing to do. And both of them did all three of them very, very well, incredibly well. And, to think about John and doing a kind of a eulogy here, a radio eulogy to him is something I could not have comprehended 2 days ago. Because whether you were reading him and, much like one of his mentors, Shirley Povich, whose last column appeared the day after he died at the age of 92, sure enough, John Feinstein has a column in today's Washington Post about Tom Izzo. And somewhat ironically, Izzo, who's a year older, is telling John he has no plans to retire. And John, I'm sure, had no plans to retire anytime soon. And sadly, he never got the opportunity to do that, passing away of an apparent heart attack at the age of 69. His brother found his body at his brother's home in McLean. I don't know any further details on that. But I have many remembrances of him. I didn't know him as well as some, but I knew him pretty well. Did a lot of radio shows with him, either as a sidekick or interviewing him on various shows. He had a regular segment with Steve Zabin and I for many years on 980, and then he went on to do that with the Junkies on 106.7. I think he did that for 12 or 13 years, and it was just recently, I guess the contract ended, and he discontinued Fridays that he would do on their show. But, man, it's a complicated life. It really is. And he carved out a niche that did not exist. His biggest claim to fame was the blockbuster book, Season on the Brink, which made it not just the best-selling sports book of all time, but one of the all-time bestsellers, spending 17 weeks, I believe, on the New York Times bestseller list. I mean, just an incredible success. They couldn't keep enough books in the bookstore, as you'll hear him tell in a podcast interview he did a few years ago. So let me get to what those who knew him even better than I did remembered about him, and then I will talk about my own personal remembrances of John Feinstein. First, the PTI tribute that Mike Wilbon gave yesterday, and I believe the closing line captures John as well as anything.
A melancholy trails to John Feinstein, who died suddenly today at the age of 69. John was one of the most successful and consequential sports writers of the last 50 years. with bestsellers like A Season on the Brink and A Good Walk Spoiled. He was also a columnist at the Washington Post, where Tony and I were colleagues along with him for decades. He was a summer intern immediately before me. After his 3 children, the great love of John's life was Duke basketball. After that, ACC basketball. After that, college basketball and golf. It's sadly poetic that John died at the gateway to March Madness and the first day of the Players, since covering golf was his other great obsession. He was a complicated man, brimming with opinions, and anyone who knew John held an opinion about him.
You know, going to school here at Maryland, loved college basketball. So Michael Wilbon is covering Georgetown. Sally Jenkins is covering Maryland. I got John Feinstein constantly writing about college basketball, and I loved Season on the Brink. What an unbelievable book about Bobby Knight.
People should pick it up and read it. I've known John since I was 20. I was an intern the summer after he was an intern. And so my life was very much directed by my relationships with John Feinstein and Anthony Kornheiser.
Yeah.
And so you look at that all these years later, and it's hard to put into, and we just get this word about John suddenly passing away this morning. And the coaches, everybody's calling each other in the industry to tell stories about John. And again, they're complicated because he could be the most charming guy in the room and the guy you wanted to throw out the room, but he was always a compelling figure.
You cannot say it any better than that. The most charming guy in the room and the guy that you wanted to throw out of the room. That sums up John Feinstein, I think, better than anything else. But there's so many different tributes that have been written and said about him in the last 12 hours or so. I think the one who really helped to carve his career, and look, they had a difficult relationship like a lot of people that John worked with, but there was incredible mutual respect on both sides. And that's George Solomon, who was his sports editor for most of the time he was there as a full-time reporter from 1977 to 1991. And he went back, he was still writing columns. As I say, he's got a column in the Post today and was due to cover the Atlantic 10 tournament this afternoon at Capital One Arena. So he maintained a relationship with the paper for many, many years. I mean, you're talking 45 years here that he was involved with the Post. But this is what George wrote in a remembrance column in the paper today. George Solomon, he wrote, Feinstein started at the Post as a sports intern in 1977. He got a full-time job in the fall on the Metro desk covering police and crime before joining an all-star sports staff that included, among others, Shirley Povich, Len Shapiro, David Kindred, Tony Kornheiser, Michael Wilbon, Tom Boswell, Sally Jenkins, Ken Denlinger, and David Remnick, who, by the way, is the editor of the New Yorker now. I mean, that's Murderer's Row right there, as I add in my own thoughts. Feinstein knew how to get a story, and he did, breaking what was major Washington NFL ownership development involving Edward Bennett Williams and Jack Kent Cooke. For that, I offered to buy him lunch at Duke Ziebert's restaurant, then a DC Power hangout. Feinstein, of course, ordered the dinner, steak, but it was a big scoop, so I acquiesced. One afternoon, a week later, I got a call in my office from Ziebert saying, the kid is here again. He's ordering another dinner steak. I thought you should know. I guess he was putting it on an expense account. Feinstein spent the next several years bouncing back and forth between sports and Metro, which was run at the time by Bob Woodward and David Marinus. He also kept writing books, as many as 2 a year, about pro football, college football, Army, Navy, which, by the way, a Civil War, John said many times that was his favorite book. Golf, tennis, baseball, and a weekly luncheon hosted by the late Boston Celtics icon Red Auerbach, and they wrote a book called Let Me Tell You a Story. Feinstein also wrote more than 50 sports books, plus another bunch for children. No one else comes close. Feinstein knew how to push my buttons, and this is where we get to kind of although George didn't say like Perry White, Great Caesar's ghost, he was more likely to say oy vey when it came to John. He said, Feinstein knew how to push my buttons, such as when he lost his rental car at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics and blamed me. He regularly sparred with the likes of Georgetown coach John Thompson and North Carolina State's Norm Sloan, and occasionally it escalated to my office. In one heated telephone squabble, Sloan began cursing at me. And Feinstein asked Sloan, why are you cursing him out? Because he hired you, Sloan said. Feinstein once said he would kill one of our editors if the editor deleted the last paragraph of Feinstein's Davis Cup coverage. The editor killed the paragraph anyway. The next day, I called Feinstein and asked him whether he had threatened to kill a colleague. Yep, he replied. They both lived well and lived long enough to tell about him. In the heat of the moment, not everyone appreciated Feinstein. Over a career spanning more than 4 decades, millions of readers did. Today, the business is less without him. David Marinus put up a post on Facebook, and I like this couple of lines that he wrote. One was, and this was the personality of John, he would talk for hours about life and sports and stories that he picked up along the way, and then he would pause and he would say, "Enough about me. What do you think about me?" And it was a joke. I mean, he could tell a joke on himself, but he was bombastic. He was confrontational at times, but he was also someone, and this is what I appreciated about him most, he never big-timed anybody. Never. And that was also part of the success that he had in building up these relationships with coaches and players who would go on to do other things. And, you know, he wouldn't only know the star players on the teams that he covered. He knew the walk-ons, because the walk-ons would eventually become, in some cases, graduate assistants and then move up the chain. And one day they would become head coaches. And he had this relationship that he had built with them. He knew Gary Williams, a great friend of John's, and they were very, very close and spent a lot of time together. But it started when Gary was a young head coach at American University, and John was a young sports writer, one of the few who actually did cover what was a pretty low-level team of interest in the area. And he cultivated that relationship for the rest of his life, including the players who were on the team, the assistant coaches, so forth and so on. And Marinus adds in, his life was like a Russian novel, full of drama, often of his own making, and a fabulous cast of characters. And that really sums it up as well. All the people that he knew. I mean, it's not just the hundreds of thousands of people who read his books and his columns. It's the thousands and thousands of people that he picked up along the way in relationships and got in early on some of the giants of the game. It's not like, he knew Dean Smith when he was already a Hall of Fame coach, although Dean Smith was well on the way to that when John, as a student reporter at Duke, managed to get one-on-one interviews in Dean Smith's office. I mean, one thing about John, he grew up in Manhattan. And when you grow up in Manhattan, you grow up a little bit differently, like I did in the suburbs, where anywhere you wanted to go, your mom had to drive you. In Manhattan, you hop on the subway. You go where you want to go. And as a kid, long before he could drive, and I guess the family didn't even have a car living in Manhattan, he'd hop on the subway and go down to Madison Square Garden and watch the Knicks play, or a college basketball doubleheader, or he'd take the 7 train out to Shea Stadium to watch the Mets. And those passions fueled him throughout his life. He just really loved what he did. And, some will look at this and say, 69 years old, never got a chance to retire. But I also look at it like his work was his life. Yes, he had a family. He had 2 kids from his first marriage and now 14-year-old daughter from his second marriage, and he loved them dearly. But he also truly loved what he did. He longed past the need to work. I mean, he could have retired after Season on the Brink, which came out in 1987. And we'll get to Season on the Brink and how it, skyrocketed his career to all the prolific writing that he did. But no, it was just a labor of love for him. And while it is tragic that he's dead at such a young age, also, he was in the midst of what he loved to do throughout his life and had reached the point where he could walk into any setting and hold court. If he walked into a room full of college basketball coaches, they all knew him. If he walked out to the driving range at a major, all the golfers knew him. If he went to a baseball game and he'd spent seasons doing books on baseball players, he knew many of the people involved in the game. I mean, it's just an incredible outpouring that you'll see on social media for John Feinstein. One of his colleagues, Pat Forty, who's a frequent guest on Tony's show now with Sports Illustrated, talked about the Feinstein seat, which is in the Indiana Gym, Assembly Hall, where John had covered Indiana games from courtside for years, but after he wrote Season on the Brink, was kind of banished there, and we'll get to more on that story coming up. But he looked at it as a badge of honor. Like, Bobby Knight was so angry at him for the book, and that he did not compromise any of his principles in writing this book, that Knight was angry because and this is funny to say, but he was shown using too much profanity in the book, which anyone who's been around Knight knows that, F is an adjective. He used it for everything. More from 40. Feinstein, who shockingly died Thursday at the age of 69, feared nothing as a writer and reporter. He bent for no one, not even Bob Knight in his prime, who ranks alongside John Thompson as the most intimidating coaching figures in college basketball history. He became a one-man institution, holding court with equal authority at the Final Four Coaches Convention or on the driving range at a major event. Feinstein may not have created the genre of spending a season inside a single topic and turning it into a book, but he perfected it. He grasped the granular detail that brought scenes and people alive. He wasn't an exalted wordsmith who spun lyrical prose, but he was a ceaseless reporter. And I think even John would admit that he was more of a reporter than a writer, that his writing was not necessarily lauded in the way that people like Frank DeFord were. I mean, he was a dogged reporter. He got the story. He got you inside what was going on. Doing those books, 40 writes, required stamina and inexhaustible amount of curiosity, showing up day after day for months, layering in observations and information, building relationships with the story, living it up and down. He became affixed to teams without becoming a shill, an increasingly scarce quality in an era where information is often traded for positive publicity. That's a very important point that 40 makes about John Feinstein. Yeah, I've told you he could be confrontational, but he would never compromise his principles. And even Tony, who is much the same way and an outstanding reporter and columnist, he would say to you, look, Gary Williams is a friend. I'm in the tank for him. So if it was a little bit soft in a column, there would be an explanation. Gary and John were close, and John was someone who admired Gary and wrote great things about Gary. But if he thought that there was something that Gary did wrong and he wanted to criticize, he wouldn't hold back. And one of the stories he tells, and John was hard to say it, was the greatest Lefty Driesell historian. For a number of years, John was the beat reporter for the Washington Post for Maryland. And he and Lefty, they had their battles and they became friends, much like many of his relationships. But he told the story of Lefty calling him at home. The paper would arrive at Lefty's house, no internet in those days. And the paper would arrive at his house, and he'd read Feinstein's story. He was not a columnist then. He covered college basketball, but it was a story about Maryland, and there was something that Lefty didn't like, and he cussed him out on the phone. And Feinstein said, well, okay, and this is what good reporters do. They show up anyway. And he went to practice the next day, and he was standing on the sidelines watching practice, and he sees Lefty walking over, and he's thinking, oh, God, he's going to have part two. He said, no. He said, Lefty just sidled up to him and said, hey, Feiney, what are you doing here? Looking for a scoop? And that was that. It was forgotten. It says a lot about both of them, that they were able to move on. Let me tell one more Lefty story before we get to the John's story of how Season on the Brink became the phenomenon that it did. This is he could not only do Lefty's accent, he also had the cadence down. I mean, it was perfect. And I must have heard him tell this story 10 times over the years, but I never heard it and did not laugh. This was when he was, again, covering Maryland, and he wanted to do a lengthy story on Lefty. And Lefty said, well, why don't you come over to the house on a Sunday morning for breakfast? So John shows up, and he said Lefty called his wife Joyce. They'd been high school sweethearts. They'd been married forever. I think when Lefty died, she may have predeceased him, but they were married for something like 60 years, maybe longer. But he would call her Mama. He called his wife Joyce Mama. And he said, Mama, make us some hotcakes. This is how John tells it. And so she makes a big, big stack of pancakes. And Lefty and John sit down at the breakfast table, and Lefty's putting up a big stack of pancakes and slathering butter all over them. And John's got a big stack of pancakes, and they're matching each other pancake for pancake. And then finally, there's one pancake left on the plate, or hot cake, as Lefty called them. And John said, oh, go ahead. And Lefty said, no, you go ahead. I'm on diet. And it was just, oh, God, I could just hear it in my head, him telling the story. And that was what he was. He was a great, great storyteller. He really was. And just so many different stories to tell about him. I'll have some more remembrances coming up, plus his story, as he told it on a podcast a couple of years ago, about how Season on the Brink became the book that it has become. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
We are remembering the life of John Feinstein, who passed away yesterday at the age of 69 of an apparent heart attack. Just a prolific writer of books and columns, and did newspaper, radio, TV. I mean, he did it all, and did it as well as anyone has, with a personality that took no prisoners, I guess is the way to put it. And he knew so many people, and he knew them for so long. I mean, long before they became icons, like Mike Krzyzewski, who talked to Pete Thamel, who covers college sports for ESPN, and Krzyzewski said this: John was brilliant. He was one of the best writers for sports of all time. We were great friends. I loved John, but I knew he was polarizing. You loved him or you hated him. He understood that. He handled it well. He is that because he was so damn talented. You don't become polarizing if you're mediocre. He had a really great relationship. He would always call me captain. That's because when I left the military, I was a captain. Whenever he would say captain, it was putting me in that place. You're not this Coach K big time or whatever. It was at that level. Captain. No one ever called me captain my whole life except John. This was an early time in my career. I don't know what the hell I was doing. I just told Knight, that's Bob Knight, John is my friend. He's one of the greatest writers ever. If you agree to do this, meaning the book, Season on the Brink, he is going to write an amazing book. I don't know what that means. I think Coach Knight had some problems with it. At the end of the day, John portrayed him in the right way. I think the people who read that book understand Coach Knight better as a result of that book. John was incredibly good. That's Mike Krzyzewski talking to Pete Thamel. Let me give you a few things about my memories of John before we get to his explanation of how Season on the Brink really rocketed his career in 1987. I'd seen him at a couple of Final Fours that I covered for UPI, the one in 1985 when Georgetown was upset by Villanova. He was a writer covering college basketball for the Post. I knew who he was. He was not yet John Feinstein, author of Season on the Brink, but he was well known in sports circles, and I think he had already made some appearances on the Sports Reporters, the TV show that was on Sunday mornings on ESPN. Tony did that. Bill Conlon was hosted wonderfully by Dick Schaap. Mike Lupica did it. John Saunders replaced Dick Schaap when he passed away. It was the trailblazing show for writers talking about sports on television, and it led to well, we now have PTI, of course, and all the other different types of shows in that genre. But that was the first, and John was a panelist on that. And then in 1992, I became Tony's sidekick as we started Sports Radio 570. And, man, you knew right away that there was this older brother, younger brother, sibling rivalry relationship right away. Because, like every other sentence, it seemed, Tony was talking about Junior. And Junior was the nickname that Tony had given John Feinstein. And the reason he gave it to him was that John was from New York, as was John McEnroe, and John McEnroe is John Jr. and was often called Junior. And Tony noticed the same type of argumentative personality that John had, John Feinstein, similar to John McEnroe, and they're a similar age. McEnroe's a few years younger. And he said, "You're just like John McEnroe. You're Junior." And he'd only call him Junior. He never called him John. He called him Junior. And so there was this thing that was going on between the two of them, and he'd say, come into the radio studio, he might say it on the air, something off and off the air. I can't believe what Junior said in the newsroom the other day. But there was a mutual respect, too. And both of them were on their way to these unbelievable careers. Now, Tony was a little bit older. John actually had been at the paper for a couple of years when Tony got there, but Tony came as a style columnist, as a matter of fact, and then missed the sports world. So he went back to being a sports writer and eventually became a columnist. And when he was a columnist and John was a beat reporter, they would often cover the same events, whether it was tennis or basketball. John would write the game story and Tony would write the column. So they traveled around a lot. And there was this kind of cool friction that was going on. It was definitely younger brother, older brother, but as things went on and they both achieved their own level of success, at times they would be like a bickering married couple, and then at times like a very bitter divorced couple fighting over child custody or whatever. But in the end, I think you look at their relationship and what they meant to each other. I don't think there have been too many people who have observed them over the years and didn't think, there's some real connection going on there. As a matter of fact, as much success as PTI has had, there was kind of a test with this several years. PTI started in 2001, so I want to say late 90s. ESPN actually did a face-off segment between Tony and Feinstein, where they would argue about a particular topic for about 2 minutes, and they would incorporate it into SportsCenter. I think they called it face-off, and they would argue and then do an about-face and walk off camera. And I guess that planted the germ of the idea to have this show like PTI that was going to be very much like what Mike and the Mad Dog had been doing on radio for a few years, more than a few years, probably 10 or 12 years on WFAN. And that's what they launched in 2001 with PTI. And here it is 24 years later, and it's still going. But it really, the arguing in the newsroom, it was kind of three-way. It was Tony and Feinstein, and then Tony and Wilbon, and all three of them achieved this television success based on their very strong opinions. They didn't call them hot takes in those days; they were strong opinions. So anyway, we do the radio show, and you got to remember this. This is 1992. There's no internet, so you can't check things. And John, I don't know whether he had, this is a condition, I don't know the name of it, but I do remember a 60 Minutes report on this probably 20 years ago about people who have these remarkable memories, like photographic memories. So, and Mary Lou Henner was one of them. And you could say to them, what day of the week was March 10th, 1980? And they would tell you, Wednesday. What were you wearing? A red shirt. And I don't know if you could check on the red shirt, but you could check that day was, in fact, a Wednesday. And I think John had some of that because he could remember everything, which really helped him as a reporter, too, because a lot of times when he was doing his work, he didn't have a notebook with him, but he could quote people accurately off the top of his head. And he remembered everything, including the games he went to as a kid. And so pre-internet, Tony would be talking about a particular topic, and he would say, anybody know the answer to that? And if I couldn't remember, or Gary Braun, who was producing the show, couldn't remember, he'd just say, Junior, call in. And sure enough, a couple minutes later, Feinstein would call in, and we had this sound drop. If you're a longtime listener, you may remember this, where Tony in an echo chamber would say, Junior, czar of sports, which is what he called him because Feinstein, he thought, knew everything and had an opinion on everything in sports. And sure enough, John would correct him, and then they'd get into arguing back and forth. And it was great radio. And then Wilbon would get in on the act sometimes, and both of them did fill-ins for Tony as I worked with them and really enjoyed that. But John was just a force of nature in that way. And a couple of other things that are worth mentioning on this in that same vein. I read some of, if you're just jumping in, I read some of what George Solomon wrote in a column today in the Post. George, the longtime sports editor of the Washington Post and essentially John's boss for well over a decade. And then John would tell this story too. It's called the Whole Duck Story. And John, growing up, he didn't like turkey. So his mother on Thanksgiving, especially for John, would make him a duck. So one Thanksgiving, John sits down at the table a little bit later than everybody else, and he notices that his father is eating the duck that was supposed to be only for John. and he gets in such a snit about his dad eating the duck that he goes in his room for the rest of the day, and wouldn't eat the duck. And so George, having his head-butting battles with John over the years, hears him tell that story. And the next day, Feinstein is sitting at his desk, and he hears this loud thump. And he looks over, and he sees George has dropped a frozen duck on the desk. And he says to John, "That's the problem with you. You always want the whole duck." And that obviously got a very big laugh. He would talk about his favorite book, and there were lots of books, but the one that he liked the best was not Season on the Brink, although he obviously credits it for the great success that he had in his career. But his favorite book to write was The Civil War, where he got to spend a season going back and forth between the Naval Academy football team and the Army. And then it culminated with the Army-Navy game, in which there's an emotional end where both teams sing each other's alma mater on the opposite sidelines, and then they go off together as fellow soldiers to write. He was very moved by this, and I remember when this started for him, because I was actually listening on the radio. Mutual Radio at that time, this would have been, I think, 1990 or maybe 91, they were carrying the Army-Navy game. And it was Tony Roberts, who was one of my idols, one of the great play-by-play broadcasters. He did Notre Dame for many, many years. And he was doing the game, and his partner was Fran Kersey, former coach. And Kersey had laryngitis. And so they needed somebody to do color with Tony. And John, who had spent the week for the Washington Post covering the build-up to the game, traveling between West Point and Annapolis, was well-versed in the players. So he sat in the radio booth, and I think that may have been his first broadcasting experience. I'm not sure about that, but he did a really good job doing color, and then he went down and covered the game, and he was very moved by the way these teams interacted at the end of the game, which launched that book, A Civil War, which was his favorite. I mentioned the people that he dealt with and the love that he had for Lefty Driesell. There was also love and respect for John Thompson, though, like a number of his relationships, at a rocky time. And John had the access that he wanted covering Maryland. There was no problem with that. But John Thompson did things differently at Georgetown. He wouldn't let his freshmen talk to the media at all. And there was no greater freshman sensation than Patrick Ewing in 1981. But he couldn't talk to the media that entire year. And the players that were allowed to talk to the media, they usually had an assistant coach standing next to him during the interviews in the locker room, and they would say to the player from time to time, "Oh, you don't have to answer that question." And John hated that. He butted heads with Thompson, but, it was Thompson's team, and he got his way, and I think he respected John's tenacity, but he wasn't going to buckle to it. Anyway, John was very philanthropic and very generous with his time and his energy. And in writing A Good Walk Spoiled about the golf tour, he got to be friends with Tom Watson. And Tom Watson's caddy was Bruce Edwards. And he got to, and, much like the way he did all of his work, he got to know everybody. He didn't need to know just the golfers. He needed to know their caddies, their wives, their kids, whatever. Anybody, he would talk to anybody. As I say, never big time, a single person, never thought of anybody as too small to talk to. And so he got to know Bruce, and Bruce tragically contracted ALS and didn't have health insurance. And John threw a big fundraising golf tournament for a couple of years at Caves Valley and had all of his, big-time coach friends go there and other, celebrities that he knew and athletes along the way, and they raised millions of dollars for that. He also, for quite a few years, helped to put on the BB&T Classic. And that was a basketball tournament early in the season, like late November, maybe it was early December. And they played it at, I may have even started at U.S. Air Arena or the old Capitol Center. And then when the new arena opened in 1997, he started having his tournament there. And his idea was he would get Georgetown and Maryland in every year and a rotating mid-major, whether it was AU, George Mason, George Washington. And then he would call on people that he knew well. He couldn't bring in an ACC team because, Gary wasn't going to play another ACC game, but he'd bring in Kansas, Michigan State, Michigan, you name it. Big-name schools, big-name coaches would bring their teams in because of the respect that they had for John, and they knew how much he put into it, and they would have a 2-day tournament with, like a 1 versus 4, kind of a setup, and then the 2 winners would meet on Sunday for the championship. And Gary and Maryland participated every year. That was no problem. But John Thompson wouldn't do it. John Thompson never did it for him. And, they could both be headstrong. They were alike in many ways. And John, I think, at times was petty about this, to be honest. And I think even he would have admitted in the end that he was petty because he would rip Thompson wherever he went. And he went on lots of radio shows, national shows, local shows. And then when John Thompson started doing the radio show with us after he left coaching, which would have been, 1999, he would rip him for his performance on the radio. It was real bitterness, and it was bitterness over the fact that John Thompson wouldn't do what John thought was the right thing, to have his team participate in a basketball tournament that the money went to charity. And this went on for years and years, and there had been bad blood going back to when John covered college basketball for the Post, and in a freelance job, he wrote a column in the Sporting News in which he called the program Hoya Paranoia, referring to the fact that Thompson wouldn't allow reporters access to his players, and they were paranoid about everything. And Thompson got really mad, and he could get mad. Oh, boy, he could get mad. And he supposedly, according to John, called George Solomon, the sports editor, and asked that John be fired, which, of course, George didn't do. But anyway, this is now going on into probably 2009, maybe 2010. It's been going on for a while, this feud, and mostly on the end of John Feinstein, not John Thompson. But something really incredible happened, and it says a lot about both of them. And I'm really almost emotional talking about this, but since I knew both of them as well as I did, I can really feel the passion on this. And John Feinstein had been a participant in a Tuesday luncheon that Red Auerbach did forever. He did it every Tuesday at the China Doll in Chinatown. He loved Chinese food. And he would have people who he had, met along the way, friends, and people would gather, and Red would tell stories. He would tell stories about his incredible career, winning all the championships with the Celtics, his days playing at George Washington, you name it. And John was a regular participant in that and got Red to agree to write a book, which was Let Me Tell You a Story. And it was Red telling stories about his incredible life. And over the years, they became friends. And as Red got older, he became more infirmed. It was tougher for him to get around. At one time, he was on oxygen, and I don't know, he may have even been in a wheelchair at the end. And the one person that John Thompson revered as much as anyone, maybe more than anyone, was Red Auerbach, who he had known since he was a kid. Red was the one who convinced him to go to school in New England because in those days, the NBA had territorial rights. And if you went to college in New England and your hometown team didn't have a team like Wilt Chamberlain and the Philadelphia teams, the Philadelphia Warriors at the time, your rights conveyed to the team that you played college basketball for. So Providence's rights conveyed to the Celtics, and Red Auerbach got John that way, and he was his coach for 2 years before John left to do other things, including coaching later at Georgetown. But he thought the world of Red. He said he never saw anybody who knew how to handle handle men the way that Red did. And he saw, and this is an amazing thing that happened. He saw the way that John was taking care of Red. And he was so moved by this that he called John and he said, we got to bury the hatchet. We got to get over this. And they did. And for the rest of John Thompson's life, and he died about three or 4 years ago, and John's relationship with him was incredible. They were good friends and spoke all the time because there was this great mutual respect between the two of them and what they had accomplished. Just, I could go forever, and I got a few more things to throw in. I didn't think I'd do a full hour on this, but there's just so many different stories to talk about with him, and we'll do more of that as we continue, including John's recount of how Season on the Brink became the monster bestseller that it did.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
There is so much to say about John Feinstein, who died yesterday at 69. If, in fact, Tony's doing his show today, be on 2 o'clock, and I would imagine he'll spend most of it, if not all of it, on John. So many different stories to tell about him, so many different things that he did in his life, and all the books. But the book that launched him was Season on the Brink, and the backstory on it is really remarkable. How he went from he was 28 years old. He was a young sports writer at the Washington Post, covering college basketball, to almost instantly becoming a best-selling author and in demand to write many books, which he ultimately did. An incredibly prolific author, putting out over 50 books, mostly about sports. He may have written one or two that was not a sports book, and he also wrote a couple of children's books, novels for his children. He had 3 kids, 2 of them are grown, and he leaves behind a daughter who's 14 from his second marriage. But this was on a show that was a couple of years ago. Mike Vaccaro, who's a sports writer with the New York Post, does a podcast, and he had John on as a guest. And, of course, when you have John on, and I did a podcast with him some years ago, you have him tell the story of how Season on the Brink got off the ground and how it became the book that it became.
I had covered Knight's Olympic team in 1984. Had developed a relationship with him. I was one of a handful of reporters he liked and trusted, I guess, and gave access to. And I actually went out to Indiana in February of '85 when they were having a terrible season, spent several days with him and had total access during that time. Sat with him in the locker room before the games. He walked me into the locker room when he talked to the players, went to practice. Talked to him at great length, and as it happened, that was the week he threw the chair. And I wrote a very long piece about him that it started with the chair for obvious reasons, and but said in the piece that on the scale of crimes being committed in college athletics today, throwing a chair was probably, on a scale of 1 to 10, was probably about a 3. And he actually called me. Usually when people call you after you write about them, it's to complain about something. But he thanked me for, as he said, telling both sides of the story. And I said, well, Bob, I was able to tell both sides because of the access you gave me while I was out there. And he invited me to a dinner that he had in those days on Final Four Saturday, because in those days, the games were still played in the afternoon. I miss those days. And I realized he was inviting me into his inner circle. It was his coaches, former coaches, buddies. And I thought to myself, if I could get him to give me the kind of access I had for the 2 days I was out there for a season, there might be a book in it. I'd never written a book. I was 28 years old, and asked a couple friends what they thought. And they said, yeah, if you can get him to do it, it might be a hell of a book. So that night after the dinner at the Final Four, I asked him if he had a few minutes to talk, and he said, yeah, come on back to the room. He was rooming with the great Pete Newell, his mentor, and Mike Krzyzewski was there because he and Knight were doing a clinic the next day, and they had to plan the clinic. So they talked for a few minutes while I talked to Coach Newell, and then Bob said, John, what can I do for you? So I walked through it. I said, next year's going to be critical for you because this year was so bad. I'm thinking if I could come out and have the kind of access I had when I was there earlier this season, there might be a book in it. And he said, have you ever written a book? And I said, no. And he said, do you have a publisher? And I said, Bob, I didn't think there was much point trying to get a publisher until you said yes. And he said, yeah, if you can find a publisher, come on out. And that turned out to be the bigger challenge, actually, because 5 publishers rejected the book.
Wow.
Yeah, much the way 5 publishers rejected this new book, which is sort of a full circle type of thing. But when I walked out the door that night with Krzyzewski, as soon as the door closed, he looked at me and he said, are you out of your blanking mind? And you're volunteering to spend a season with him? And I said, well, you played for him for 4 years. He said, I needed to go to college. Last I looked, you've been to college. I said, well, you worked for him too. And he said, yeah, I needed a job. Last I looked, you've got a pretty good job. And I said, well, I want to try it anyway. So as I said, 5 publishers rejected it. Macmillan, an editor named Jeff Newman, finally gave me a small advance, and I went and did the book.
And you thought you were going to lose money off of this?
I on the front end, I did lose money because I think I was making about $65,000 a year at the Post, and my advance was $17,500, and I had to take a leave of absence, obviously. So yeah, I certainly was losing money on the front end. I never dreamed I would make the money I made on the back end.
Were you surprised about the overall success of this? I mean, again, at the time in the 80s, I mean, Bob Knight was obviously a big name in college basketball. So it really took off, but you were still surprised by the success it had?
Well, sure. I mean, it was my first book. I thought I had some remarkable material from the access Bob gave me, and he never backed off during the entire season from that access. But I had no idea. I was hoping the book would do well enough that I would get to write a second book. That was my thought when the book came out, and then it just went crazy. And I remember going to do a book signing in Bloomington. My first initial book tour was 2 days, one day in Indianapolis, one day in Bloomington. And I pulled up to the bookstore. It was a store called TIS right off the campus. And I saw this line around the block. And I thought, geez, what celebrity do they have here today? Nobody. I'm not going to sell a single book. And I walked in, and the manager was standing there, and he said, how do you like the line? I said, who is it for? What's going on here? He looked at me. He said, it's for you. And I was stunned. And I ended up signing 1,000 books in a couple hours, and went to another bookstore at a Walden's and did the same thing. And I was literally getting calls from bookstores saying, we can't get enough copies of your book.
Wow.
And Macmillan, the publisher, was kind of slow in going back for second and third and fourth printings. And finally, they just said, to hell with it, and published another 100,000 books in the next printing. And when it landed on the bestseller list at number, I think it was number 13 the first week, I thought, wow, I wrote a New York Times bestseller. Isn't that great? And a couple weeks later, it was number 2 behind Bill Cosby's fatherhood book, ironically. And I called my dad and my mom, and I said, the book's number 2 on the bestseller list. And my dad said, well, why isn't it number 1? That was my dad. And I said, Dad, Bill Cosby's number 1. He's been number 1 for a year. I mean, this is as good as it's going to get. Well, a week later, I was number 1. Then my dad got excited.
Wow. So that's John Feinstein's recollection, the late, great John Feinstein, of how Season on the Brink became the phenomenon that it did. And, man, it's just remarkable what he was able to do after that. You know, as he said, he just hoped to write a second book, and he wound up writing over 50 more. And the one thing about the book, Knight hated it because he didn't think he should be portrayed cursing, which he did all the time. But the other thing is that it portrayed Knight in a way that I had not seen him before. I mean, my image of him was throwing the chair, this tyrant. And you heard these stories about him pushing a police officer into a trash can at the Pan American Games, and just a big brute and a bully. And you read this book and you realize the humanity that Bob Knight had, and how much I liked him so much more after I read the book than before I read the book. And John really accomplished something there. It was not the first book of that type. There was a book called The Breaks of the Game, written by David Halberstam about a decade earlier, about the Portland Trailblazers. And that was a team that was defending champs and started off 50-8 until Bill Walton broke his foot and everything fell apart. But that was the basis for the idea to write this book, that you could spend an entire season with the team and write kind of a day-by-day diary and tell different stories. And that's what the great talent of John Feinstein was. He was a great, great reporter, a great, great storyteller, and someone I considered to be a friend for 30 years. And I will miss him. I will miss his work. And the one thing about writing books is they endure, and they will be a testament to a life of incredible stories, incredible conflict over the years, a complicated legacy, but in the end, someone that I very much admired. Rest in peace, John Feinstein. We'll get to some other things coming up. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630. I have been trying to get to this all week, and there are just so many things that have been happening. It gets pushed to Friday, but there was a great series that was written in the Washington Post in the early part of the week by Dave Sheinin about how analytics have dramatically changed sports, some for the better, like football and possibly hockey, and some for the worse, like baseball and basketball. And he's got great numbers and great analysis on why that's the case. And just to highlight basketball, Steph Curry last night hit his 4,000th career three. He is more than 1,000 ahead of second place Ray Allen. And Ray Allen was a great three-point shooter who played forever in the NBA. And it just goes to show you how the analytics of it's better to take a bad three than a good two. And Curry's, the best ever at shooting the three. But they say, don't shoot the two, shoot the three, even if you're not the best three-point shooter, because you get 50% more points when you shoot the three. And whether it's made the game easier to watch or worse, I think it's worse. There's some numbers to back all that up that Sheinin has that we will get to. Spent a lot of time, in fact, all the time in the first hour, talking about John Feinstein, who died yesterday at the age of 69. He's found by his brother, apparent heart attack, and he wrote many, many books. He wrote, as far as I know, only one about pro football, and it was called Next Man Up, and it was a season inside with the Ravens when Brian Billick was coaching there. This would have been 2006, 2007, something like that, and Dion was playing there. And the Next Man Up refers to what everybody knows about football is you have an injured player, there's another guy to step into his spot. That's just the way it works. It's a game of attrition. And he was really not a football guy. He had grown up as, I guess, a Jets fan. He liked Joe Namath, but he really was not one who covered Super Bowls or only when he had to, covered Redskin games. In fact, one of the stories he liked to tell, and this kind of illustrates his personality, when he was in his early 20s and in the sports department at the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, the legendary Ben Bradley, walks in and is kibitzing with a couple of the guys working at the time, and he said something about, how do you think we're going to do on Sunday? And Feinstein, I don't think he even knew him, said to him, I didn't know the Washington Post bought a football team. Bradley didn't like that, but I think he understood Feinstein's talent because Bob Woodward had been his boss at the Metro section of the paper, so he had already, I guess, established himself. Otherwise, snot-nosed kid saying that to Ben Bradley, I don't know how that goes over. So John was not caught up in all the minutia that goes on with pro football, but I like it, and this is the time of year where we dive into who's staying and who's going for the football team, and the big moves, of course, that they made. They trade for Laramie Tunsil of Houston, and they trade for Marshawn Lattimore earlier in the year at the trade deadline from the Saints, and they also made the trade to get Deebo Samuel. So those are the three big names, and then it's a matter of bringing in various free agents, and then we've kind of reached the point now where they're re-signing the guys that they have. And much like Noah's Ark, there are two Noahs. Noah's Ark had two of everything. They got two Noahs who are coming back. Noah Igbenogany, who's a cornerback who's going to return, and Noah Brown. He's the one that caught the Hail Mary pass in the Chicago game. He's coming back on a 1-year, $4.5 million deal. He was a great pickup, cut by Houston just before the start of the season. Got hurt with about 6 or 7 games left to go, so they didn't have him for the playoffs. But he made a big contribution, including the catch in the Hail Mary game. They brought back a tackle by the name of Sheldon Day, who you're probably not familiar with, but he stepped in when Jonathan Allen had that torn biceps. Allen made it back, but they chose not to keep him. He signed with Minnesota. They also got Kevon Seymour back. He's a cornerback on a 1-year deal, mostly special teams. Same for KJ Osborne, who's a wide receiver, 1-year deal. This is kind of a surprise here. Michael Dieter, who's an offensive lineman and who filled in at center and not that well He's coming back. That surprises me. They also elected not to use him at guard when Sam Cosmi got hurt, and they put Trent Scott, who's a tackle, at guard. So I don't quite understand this. They must see some great potential. He's 28 years old, but he's coming back. Allen, as I mentioned, is gone to Minnesota. Jeremy Chen, who did a nice job this past year, he signed with Vegas. Benjamin St. Juste has gone to L.A. to go to Los Angeles. De'Ami Brown goes to Jacksonville. Cornelius Lucas to Cleveland. And Derek Forrest is with Buffalo. They still have some free agents on the list. Cleland Farrell is one of them. Dante Fowler is also an unsigned free agent. I wonder about this because he's kind of attacked them on social media, said some things, I think one of them was deleted, but, he's not happy about being ignored. So I don't know if he's coming back. And Jeff Driscoll, who's a quarterback, is still available and from last year's roster as Jamison Crowder is. Crowder was here when they were still the Redskins. I think he was here as early as like 2015, if I'm not mistaken. So he could come back too. But there's others out there that they're looking at, and we'll see as free agency continues. Anyway, Dallas Cowboys are not really active now. There's a report that Cooper Kupp, who's been cut by the Rams, might be signing with them. But once again, it's crickets, and it's probably because of the way that Dallas has handled the salary cap. They may not have the cash to do it. Tom Pelissero covers the NFL Network, covers the Cowboys for the NFL Network on the Dan Patrick Show yesterday with the Dallas situation.
The Cowboys are just so generally inactive that it just makes you wonder what's their plan. Obviously they've got a new coaching staff in there. Brian Schottenhauer getting promoted to head coach. Matt Eberflus coming in as the defensive coordinator. We've seen them make some, relatively smaller moves. They traded yesterday for a couple of former high draft picks, Kenneth Murray and Kyer Elam. But, Murray had been a fine player, but that was a salary dump for Tennessee. And Kyer Elam had started like 12 games over 3 years. That's kind of like the Jonathan Mingo trade they made last year from Carolina, where they gave up a fourth for a guy that they thought was a really top wide receiver in the draft, but he hadn't had any, he hadn't had a lot of productivity. And so, their biggest free agent signings at this point, I might be forgetting somebody off the top of my head, but, Javonte Williams, a running back who I was at the game in Dallas a couple of years ago when he had the best game of his career, but he had an injury. He's not quite had the same level of productivity. You had to be sitting there and going, when Washington's making all these moves, right? They did it at the deadline last year with the Marshawn Lattimore trade. They did it with the Deebo Samuel trade this year, a Laramie Tunsil trade. They're going all in, saying, hey, we got to catch up to the Eagles. We're going to cash in right now on a rookie quarterback contract. For the Cowboys, they're locked in with Dak. They're locked in with CD. They got to figure out the Micah thing, and they're operating like a team, whether it's right or wrong, that doesn't have a whole lot of flexibility. And you just wonder, I'm not saying what they're doing is wrong, but you do wonder, okay, what's their plan for catching up in a really, really competitive division?
And I don't know if this is true, though, Tom, but it feels like Jerry Jones wants to prove how smart he is in the draft. Free agency, okay, I sign checks, but they don't go after free agents. And they have done well in the draft, but I don't know why it's like a college coach who doesn't believe in the transfer portal. You got Dabo Sweeney at Clemson. He doesn't believe in the trend. You're like, you better get up to speed. But Jerry they've never spent money. Who is it? Greg Hardy is their big free agent signing a decade ago?
That was a wild one. I saw that stat that's the last one they signed to a contract above like $8 million per year in free agency. That feels like a lifetime ago, and there's a whole Greg Hardy side story we don't need to get into there. But yeah, they've not been super active. They've been, in most cases, slower to get their long-term contracts done. And the problem with that, we see it over and over, is when you wait on these deals, all that does is give more leverage to the player, whether it's because of Dak playing out a franchise tag. It's like, why does Dak make $60 million? I see people say it all the time. How does Dak make 60? Josh Allen signed for 55. It's about leverage.
Yeah.
Dak played out a franchise tag. They were at risk of having to tag him a second time, which they did until the paperwork went through. And then he played toward the end of that deal, and he had all the leverage in this case. The same thing with CD last year, where Justin Jefferson resets the market. Now you're seeing it with Micah Parsons. If the Cowboys jumped out, whether it was, forget about last year. You jump out in March and just say, well, you know what, we're going to get this deal done with Micah. You're probably talking about, hey, we get it done about what the Max Crosby number was, right? Which is like $35.5 million a year. Now Myles Garrett gets 40. Micah Parsons' agents are sitting there going, great. We'll sit back and wait and see if we get 41. And now you potentially have another offseason where it's dominated by what's going to happen with Micah. It would give me the indication that they're at least open to exploring whether or not they would trade him. I know they've had internal discussions about, okay, what's the right thing to do when if you sign him for $40 million plus, that's going to give you a super top heavy type of a roster here. It's just that's kind of the Cowboys' way of doing business. And I definitely understand the frustration of fans who are just going, what's the plan to get better? Again, when you're chasing literally the Super Bowl champs who arguably have the best roster in football.
That's Tom Pelissero of the NFL Network. And Tony likes to say this: success is better when your enemies are failing. And as the Commanders continue to surge, the Cowboys are losing oxygen, and it's kind of fun to watch, right? And it's the ego of Jerry Jones. He says he's the general manager first and the owner second, and that's the way he wants it. And his team makes lots of money, and nobody's going to tell him he can't do it, so he does it. But the about face that this franchise has made is absolutely remarkable. I mean, think about this. Think about what it was in March of 2024. Most of us were thinking, okay, they should be better. They win 6 or 7. That'll be okay. Vegas had their odds at like 6.5. That'll be fine. Shown improvement. They won 4 the year before, and they get within a game of the Super Bowl. It's incredible. And for a place that was a cesspool for a quarter of a century, now it's the place you want to be. Among the free agent signings in the last few days, safety Will Harris, who comes over from the New Orleans Saints and remembers playing against them late in the season and said this was a place that he wanted to be.
Man, I was super excited as soon as I heard that they were in the picture. And, you see the way these guys play, whether you're across the sideline from or you're watching on TV, it's something intangible that you can see, how these guys play, the way they fly around, the way they get to the ball, the energy that they playing with, how they're playing for one another, you know what I mean? How they're playing for these coaches, how everything's just in tandem. And, obviously, you got a guy like Dan Quinn, man, it's hard not to want to run through a brick wall for him, for sure. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so all of that, I saw all of that from the outside in, man, and I wanted to be a part of it.
That's the point. He didn't step inside the organization and hang out with these guys for a few days. He could see that from across the field. And, boy, what a change that is. And for an organization where the grass was always greener someplace else, unless you got a lot of green here that you didn't necessarily deserve, like they would bring in guys like Adam Archuleta and pay him $10 million a year to be what turned out to be a bust, and $100 million for Albert Hainsworth and all that. But if you had another chance to go someplace else and the money was similar, guys did. So to see Marcus Mariota back, knowing in the best case scenario he rarely takes the field, listen to what he said about the decision to return to Washington.
It was a huge part. At the end of the day, the grass isn't always greener, and being around this league for a long time, you understand that when you have a good thing, and you have a great culture, and you have a great room, that's not everywhere. So I really, at the end of the day, something was going to have to really knock my socks off to leave this place, and I'm very happy and very blessed to be back, and I'm excited to make another run with this team.
Yeah, he's backup quarterback, but I think this is a pretty big deal whether he takes the field or not, because he will continue in his helping to develop Jaden Daniels. Daniels very, very free with his praise about what Mariota meant to him in his first year. And you remember the game against the Falcons where Daniels got banged up, came over to the sidelines, and Mariota comes over there and he says, okay, get your breath back, get back on the field, let your natural talent take over. And he did. And he threw the winning touchdown pass to Zach Ertz. The one thing he does admit, and it's understandable, that if there was a starting job out there for him, he would have gone there. Now, that was not going to happen. There's not a team that's going to, certainly pay him starter money. He's making, I believe, less than $10 million this year, and starter money is north of $25 million. But and if there was a team that was going to do that, he would have jumped at it. But there was not a team that was going to pay him that kind of money and have him start. And he admits that is still something that might be out there for him. But short of that, he was happy to come back here.
Well, I think it was always the right fit. I think for me, it was more of an ego and pride thing of seeing what was out there and seeing if I could maybe get another shot at it. I will never close that door. If that opportunity presents itself, as a competitor, I got to take it. But like I was saying earlier, there had to be something that was just very, unbelievable that you couldn't pass up that would have made me leave. And at the end of the day, after everything and having all these discussions, this was the right fit. And I'm very, very excited to be back.
One thing that you could keep an eye on, I don't think this could happen, but as the season goes on, teams lose quarterbacks and they get kind of desperate. And here's a guy who has been a starter in the league. And as we saw last year, when he needed to play, he played well. He didn't start a game, but he rescued the game against Carolina when Daniels went out early. And then when Daniels was benched or I guess protected in the second half against Dallas, he brought him back and threw the winning touchdown pass. So he can still play. And there are two names. Jeff Driscoll is not re-signed yet, but I think he could come back. And the other guy to keep an eye on is Sam Hartman. Sam Hartman was an undrafted free agent last year out of Notre Dame, but they gave him a pretty good contract for that spot. They had him off and on the practice squad. He never played in a game, but he is, I think, in their plans. I think they're looking at him down the road as a backup quarterback. And if Mariota is going to be available at a good price, less than $10 million, and the Commanders feel very, very confident that Daniels is staying healthy, and relatively speaking, he did last year. The rib injury certainly was a problem in the middle of the year, but other than that, there really weren't any issues with him. And do you do that? Do you trade a guy like Marcus Mariota with a chance to start on a team that could make a run at the playoffs or could be in the playoffs? You don't know how that's all going to work out. So I think that's one to keep an eye on. But in the meantime, good to have him here, be good in the offseason program, play some in the preseason. And if they need him to play, he can, but also could be a trade piece if they decide to go that way. By the way, on the quarterback front, this is interesting from yesterday. Sam Darnold, who is now the quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks. There was some talk that they might franchise him in Minnesota, even though they got J.J. McCarthy ready to go after that knee surgery from last year. But remember, Darnold was terrible in the last regular season game and in the playoff game. And so I think those two games probably cost him a lot of money. He's on a pretty good starting quarterback salary in Seattle. It's like $27 million a year, where the top of the line quarterback, Dak, is making 60, and the going rate for a good one is about $50 million right now. So he didn't get that, but this was an obvious question, and he handled it very well at the news conference yesterday. This is not his first rodeo. He's been with other teams, didn't work out with the Jets, didn't work out with the 49ers, didn't work out with Carolina, did work out for 16 games in Minnesota before it didn't work out. And he was asked about what he learned from the disappointing end of the season, and he said, I was waiting for someone to bring that up. He said, I appreciate that. It's fair. You get all the way to that point. You have the season that we had offensively as a team, and then you run into, at the end of the day, only one team that can win the Super Bowl, and unfortunately, we weren't that team. So I give him some credit for that. He didn't put it all on himself, but he's saying that we came up short in what we needed to do. He had thrown 35 touchdown passes over the first 16 games, only one over the final two. And he said, I think being able to get the ball out a little quicker on some of that drop back stuff that we had in those last couple of games, and understanding where the outlets are, and even if a guy is covered, if my backs are covered on a check down, just throwing it at his feet. I feel like I was taking some unnecessary sacks last year, especially in those last few games. I'll definitely be thinking about that, keeping two hands on the ball in the pocket at all times, just doing all the little fundamental things. That's a big one, just being able to get the ball out on time. So that's going to be interesting with Sam Howell, I guess, sticking around as the backup. I think that's probably the plan. But he didn't really run away from it, so I'll give him some credit on that. All right. That's a wrap for me for the week. Bram is coming up next, and I'll see you Monday morning at 9 a.m.